Hello, this is the lesson for Art 127 with Western Nevada College, a watercolor class. This lesson specifically will be the white lesson. So for an overview, what we're going to cover this time is our pigment properties. We're going to do a white chart. We're going to talk about methods for saving whites, methods for retrieving whites, and white paint options. We're going to talk about form, light, and shadow. We're going to talk about how to paint a white subject. We're going to introduce a new color harmony, triadic color harmony. So let's get started. So first, the properties of pigment. We've discussed hue and value previously. Temperature and intensity were our last lesson. This time we're going to touch a little bit on transparency, specifically opacity with our white paint, and staining quality, which means staining or lifting quality of a pigment. And finally, granulation will be in our very last regular lesson on texture. So you're going to create a white chart that compares methods for saving whites, retrieving whites, and painting whites. So first let's go over how you might save white of the paper. This is probably unique to watercolor in the painting methods. As opposed to oil painting and acrylic painting, you typically paint all your whites. But in watercolor, we tend to want to save the white of the paper. So we want to paint around some of our whites or save them in some way. So painting around the white is one common method. Some people refer to that as blocking. Another way we can save whites is using different masking methods like masking fluid, drawing gum, wax resist, a China pencil, or masking tape to create a stencil. And so I'll show you that when I get into the white chart more specifically. And what you want to do as you're creating the chart is consider what the advantages or disadvantages of each method might be. So we'll get into that when we bring up the chart. So another thing we want to do is retrieve whites. So one of the complaints against watercolors, it's hard to manage and it's hard to make corrections. You can make corrections, it just takes a little finesse. One of the things we need to learn though is how to retrieve whites once they're lost. The best method is to save them or keep them, but if we lose them, then we want to be able to get them back. We can get sort of back to white with water lifting. Depending on the pigment that we're using, we might get closer to white, or we can go a little further and do a water lifting with a little scrub afterwards. Sometimes that roughs up the paper, so we might have to wait till the end of the painting to do that. We can use bleach. I have found that the concentrated bleach that you might use in your household works much better than regular strength bleach. You can scratch back with a sharp knife, which I've done in this painting. So the cat has white hair. And you can see this is an earlier version of it where I felt like this eye was wrong and I didn't have any of the whiskers or anything. So I used a sharp knife to scratch back some of the whiskers. I used water lifting to get the eye shape back. I used just about every retrieval method in this, as well as saving some of the whites initially by painting around them or masking them off. We have this new tool. It's been about 5 years where it's become widespread usage is the Magic Eraser by Mr. Clean's Magic Eraser. And you can truly get right back to the white of the paper with it. So we'll play around with that a little bit. And then again, we want to compare the advantages and disadvantages of each method. Sometimes one method might be appropriate, sometimes another. And we'll get into that with the white chart. We can also use white paint. It's not very common in watercolor to use white paint, but there's several types of white paint that we can use. We can use acrylic white. It's compatible with watercolor because it is water soluble. We can use opaque white. Gouache is how you pronounce that word, but essentially it's a opaque watercolor medium. And then watercolor has titanium white, but watercolor titanium white is considered a watercolor pigment. And we're going to use that. And then we also have a new product out called Watercolor Ground. I've experimented a little bit. It's optional with this chart. If you have some or can get a hold of some for this chart, you're welcome to chart it as well. It really gets back to the white of the paper. So again, you want to ask yourself a question: which of these paints is closest to the white of the paper? Which is most effective? Which is least effective? Do you want to use white paint at all? How are they similar? How are they different? Is the finish the same? Maybe the finish looks different overall than it does in the gouache. So how are they different? Watercolor acrylic, you can't lift it once you paint it, but watercolor titanium white you can. Then you're going to move into a white subject painting. And so your subject has to incorporate your theme, but it has to be something that's typically known as white, like a snow or a flower, house that's white painted, a cloud, an umbrella can be white, a sheet can be white hair on an animal, something that's typically white. So this one was supposed to be snow. Just know that you have to actually paint color in a white subject. So let's talk about form. So form, remember, is a three-dimensional shape. And we have, in order to depict a white subject, we have to know how light and shadow work. So if you look at this drawing over here, first you need to know where the light is coming from and how it hits the object. So in this subject, it's coming from the top left and hits the subject. Where it hits the subject, we typically have what we call highlight. That's the white of the paper that we want to save or retrieve. And then surrounding that, we tend to have mid-tone or half-tone. In this drawing, they've separated that into two values. So here's the mid-tone that goes around the highlight, and then half-tone that's in between mid-tone and what we call the core shadow or the form shadow. So that is typically opposite the light, either halfway or beyond, depending how straight up and down the light source is. This is much darker than either mid-tone or what we're going to talk about next, which is reflected light. So what happens is the light comes down, hits the object, and then if it's round, it bounces and goes straight, and it can't quite get there. So it skips right over that, so it's quite dark there. It'll hit the surface, and then some of that light will bounce back up and reflect off the surface, depending on how dark or light the surface is, and put some light back underneath. So that's what we call reflected light, because it's reflecting off the surface. And then the final value we have is cast shadow. Now sometimes cast shadow is darker than core shadow and vice versa. It depends on the color of this object and the color of the surface. But if the color of the object is darker, then cast shadow will be darker than form shadow. But if the surface is darker than the form, then they'll switch places. So that's what we're talking about. The form or the core shadow is dark, and then you get to reflected light, and then you get to cast shadow. And in cast shadows, it's darkest where it meets the object, but then it starts to fade and become a softer edge the further away it gets from the light source. But usually right around the object, it's quite a hard edge. So that's black and white, but we want to create a color form. Then I have this little video by Rex Beanland. I'm going to go ahead and link to it for a minute.
Now just adding a little more value and a little more value, and finally adding a real dark on this side here.
So I really encourage you to watch that video from the start to finish, because this is painting in color a white object. You have to paint it. This will end up reading as a white object in the end, but you actually have to paint everything except where you save the whites. Okay, so this is a subject I painted. These were white roses. Again, I'm just saving bits of the white, but overall they read as white roses overall, hopefully. And you have in your assignment, you'll have this video of this whole painting from initial wash, and then down in here I've done a lot of retrieving of white. So I encourage you to watch this all the way through for different tutorials on how to first save and then retrieve and paint whites. So our new color harmony we're going to talk about is triadic color harmony. So triadic color harmony is where the colors are equally spaced. You pick colors that are equally spaced around the color wheel. So for instance, red, yellow, and blue are equally spaced around the color wheel. In between red and blue you have red, orange, orange, and yellow, orange in between. So there's 3 in between, and then there's the yellow. These colors are spaced equally. You wouldn't pick all 6, you just pick one of these. So make sure you pick them equally spaced. This one is secondary color harmony. So you can do violet, orange, and green is another example of triadic color harmony. You can also watch a video that's in your assignment by Stephen Quiller that talks about triadic color harmony. And so here's an example of a triadic color harmony painting by myself where I used yellow, blue, and red in the flowers. And here's an example of another painting of mine where I used triadic secondary color harmony. So this is green, violet, and orange. All right, let's talk about this white chart. Saving, retrieving, and painting whites and what you have to do. You don't have to do the first column or the first row. So the first row, you're going to have different methods for saving whites. So this is so you don't lose the whites. So the most common way to save whites is to save the whites or paint around them. And for all these blocks, you're going to first set up your chart, and then you're going to paint using phthalo blue. That's one of your colors that you should have. It's a very staining pigment, and that's going to be the best test. So use your phthalo blue, which are cool blue. And in this one, I put water down, and then I tipped in the paint. I left these 2 shapes. So you're going to put a rectangular shape and a circular shape or a curvilinear shape in each box so that you get the practice on a square subject as well as a round subject. So I put the water in, and then I didn't put water where the shapes are so that the paint would flow around it. So that's a blocking method. And in this one I use masking fluid. So this is one of your required items. You draw the shapes and then you mask it. You let the mask dry, and then you paint just right over the masking fluid into the box with the same color. And then you let that dry, and then you remove the masking fluid. And this is an optional one for you. You don't have to do that. But if you happen to have a white waxy pencil, it's called a China pencil, you can draw the shapes, color them in with the white wax, and then paint over the top of it. You can see it maybe isn't as effective as using a clear wax. This is one of your required items. So in this case, you draw the box, then you draw the shapes, and then you fill in the shapes with clear wax, and then you paint over the top of the wax, and it'll save most of it. Some of it will get into the little crevices, but for the most part it saves that shape. And ultimately you can remove the wax, but you don't have to. And then the final method is you use a masking tape and a sharp knife, and you cut out the forms with the stencil and tape them down, paint over the tape, and then once the paint's dry, remove the tape. Okay, so that's the first row. You're required to do 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. In retrieving whites, you're going to paint all these first with the phthalo blue and let the phthalo blue dry. You have to let the paint dry or you can't really get an accurate test. So in this case, we're using water lifting. So you're going to put water into the shape, let it sit for a minute, and then you're going to try to lift it back with your brush, wipe off your brush, and then lift it back again. And you can see this pigment is pretty staining. You can get some color off, but for the most part it's not as effective as some of these other methods. So this is water lifting with a towel scrub. So you do the same thing, you let it dry, and then instead of lifting it with your brush, now you're going to scrub it with a towel. You only wet the 2 shapes. You can see it's hard to control, and it does rough up the surface of the paper, so you probably want to do that last if that's what you do. Now this is the concentrated bleach. Once again, you've painted the whole cell completely with phthalo blue and let it dry, and then you're going to dip bleach. If you're going to use a brush that's not good. It might tear up your brushes, but I use a Q-tip, and then you can lift back. You might have to do several passes at it, but it's pretty effective. It doesn't go all the way back to white, but it's pretty good, especially compared to water lifting. But you do have to have concentrated bleach. And this one is scratching back the surface with a sharp knife. You have to be careful, so make sure it's a really sharp knife, and the snap knife in your supplies list is what I found to be the most effective way to keep a sharp knife. Again, one of the things you want to do is wait till the end with this one because it roughs up the surface like this towel scrub does. So you don't want to paint over it afterwards unless you want to create texture. And then this one is this new magic eraser, and it truly is magic. You can see you get almost back to the white of the paper. So in this case, very much like this one, you take a piece after you've painted and let it dry. Now you're going to tape over with masking tape so you can see your pencil lines. And you use your sharp knife to cut out the two shapes. So instead of creating a stencil that you paint over, now you're going to cut out the stencil and leave the tape over the blue. And then you're going to get your magic eraser, get it wet, squeeze out all the water, and you'll see this in the white painting demo. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 methods, and you do have to do all of those. So you need a 5-column chart. 4 in this row, 5 in this row. And this is the final way to get white back, potentially, is you need to do at least a watercolor white and an acrylic white. So that's your required supplies. You can substitute the titanium white for gouache if you happen to have it. Some of you have taken a class before maybe where you use gouache paint. If you have gouache paint, that's fine. Please do a couple of coats because the first coat, just like painting walls in your home, may not cover it enough. So if you need to let it dry and then paint it again. So both of these took 2 or 3 coats as well, and so did the acrylic. This is an acrylic pearlized white. It actually does look white in this photo. It looks silver, but it is kind of a whitish paint. And this is that watercolor ground that's optional for you. And then after you're done with all these, I want you to think about which one you might use in which situation. Do you only like masking? Do you only like painting around? Do you like the scratching back? Do you like to have the whole repertoire of tools? Or, compare when you might use one method compared to the other. So that's the white chart. That's your first exercise. This is some white roses that one of my students did. In summary then, you're going to want to learn how to save, retrieve, and paint whites. And you have to paint a white subject that incorporates your theme, and you have to incorporate triadic color harmony. So the white roses painting does not incorporate the color harmony, so you'll have to reach a little bit and stretch and imagine how you might incorporate color harmony as well. Our next lesson, we're going to do a new painting method that I call puddle painting. It's basically painting wet into wet in sections on your paper. We're going to bring in a new paper. It's most effective on hot press paper. So we're going to go more in depth on transparency and staining qualities of our pigment. We touched on transparency a little bit because all white paint is opaque. So that's the opposite end of transparent. And you want to use the staining pigment for your white chart, which is phthalo blue, is our most staining pigment. We'll evaluate all our pigments for staining quality in the next lesson. So that's the lecture for the white lesson. Please feel free to ask me questions after you've listened to the video lectures and read the assignment directions. Good luck and good painting.